Chapter 7. Eclipse in La Unarre. La Unarre is a Wirrarika name for the sacred mountain, also known as the Palace of the Governor, the Sun. The following religious phenomenon I will attempt to describe is one of many manifestations of this order displayed by the Wirrarika. For this ethnic group, like many in Mexico, practically their whole life is a sacred act, since it is tied almost entirely to their myths. In spite of the many changes that history has imposed on their way of life, they have been able to preserve, through unrelenting resistance, the general structure of their ancestral tradition. This can be observed in the sacredness they impose on everything they do, to such a degree that even those elements of modern civilization that they sparingly incorporate into their way of life have been integrated within the general feeling of their culture. The present work is the description of a Peyote ceremony called Hikuri in the indigenous tongue that I had the fortune to witness as a participating observer. It is necessary to clarify that I had had no previous studies that would have given me a moderate understanding, in ethnological terms, of the phenomenon I observed. For this same reason, the field investigation dealing with the phenomenon in question was not as profound from the academic point of view as it could have been had I known I was going to witness an event worthy of ethnographic work. Therefore, I propose this work be considered simply as a non-professional description by a novice observer on the terrain of scientific anthropology, which places us closer to the common humanist view than the viewpoint of the prepared anthropologist. In this sense, the value of this description could be in the sincerity and the spontaneity of the observer. On the other hand, not having great knowledge of the phenomenon I witnessed placed me in a position of receptivity, which I perhaps would not have achieved had I arrived knowing what I was going to see. That very ignorance put me in a condition to ascertain what I could of the phenomenon directly from the Wirrarika, which might have resulted in a closer understanding of reality from the viewpoint of the indigenous people themselves. My situation as a beginning anthropologist, without a specific plan of study, was similar to that of cultural relativism. I was visiting with two friends in the former rich mining town, today the virtual ghost town of Rio de Catorce, in the state of San Luis Potosi. When the ore was exhausted, work ceased, the large houses and estates were abandoned, and vegetation gradually took over, transforming them into relics without a roof, reminders of a prosperous era that is no more. This town was established in what for thousands of years was, and still today continues to be, the sacred region for the Wirrarika people, Human-Coluabai, the region where the luminous divinity, the deer Peyote, was born. For this reason, and in accordance with their cosmovision, the Wirrarika make a pilgrimage year after year in the semi-desert of San Luis Potosi. The few residents of the town occasionally observe the arrival of compact groups of Wirrarika on their way to Human-Coluabai. For me and my two friends, students of anthropology, to encounter one of these groups signified an event worthy of our attention. We had just arrived in town and were eating in a restaurant when in came an Indian whom we could recognize by his exquisite attire, characteristic of the Wirrarika. He quietly slipped away toward the back part of the restaurant. We, intrigued, asked our waitress, with whom we had been conversing, who he was and what he was doing there. The question did not seem to surprise her. Our conversation had revolved around anthropological questions and our interest in approaching different social groups of our country. She said he was called Pedro. In this part, as in the entire group, the names are changed to preserve the privacy of the persons and the communities. She said he was called Pedro, and he was a Wirrarika on pilgrimage. Pedro and other members of his community had passed several times through Rio de Catorce, where he had come into contact with the owner of the restaurant, who offered to periodically buy some of the artwork they crafted and whose sale would help them to subsist. The agreement was that the owner would supply the material and pay them for the labor, then later sell the product in a shop for a far higher price. Pedro was very eloquent, blessed with a disposition and an expressive capacity that contradicted the classic view of the Indian as a humble type, unsure of himself. In the several encounters we had with him, he became what seemed like an informant. But more than anything else, he became our friend. It was he who introduced us a little into the vision of the Wirrarika world, which we found functioning to a surprising degree. Also, it was he who allowed us to attend the ceremony that motivated this work. Contrary to what misinformed people of the city are accustomed to think, Indians do not regard white people as superior beings. Rather, they tolerate and treat us with patience. Their attitude is, the whites and the Mexicans are crazy. They do not respect the sacredness of the world and are sick for money and desire for property. They are dangerously crazy since they have the power to cause problems, which is what they normally do. Far from being arbitrary, these observations were made during several conversations we had with the Wirrarika from Pedro's group, which was made up of a variety of men and women who spoke Spanish. Almost always they spoke in their own language, avoiding Spanish even in front of mestizos and whites. However, with us, they were always courteous, and we were able to establish a good communication. We noticed that the males treated their women very affectionately. The women did not appear to be subordinated. Rather, they were listened to, attended to, and were participants in the affairs of the community. We also noticed the care and love which they all devoted to the children, especially the smallest. We observed also a notable cohesion within the group. We had the impression that this cohesion had its basis in the cosmovision of the group which, in their own words, was oriented toward an ordinary life, walking straight. I want to underline the fact that we remained strongly impressed by the congruence they demonstrated in their way of life and their spiritual conceptions, which they expressed more with their actions than with their words. The quality and moral force they displayed reaffirmed that we, members of the Western superculture, have much to learn from the cultures mistakenly called primitive. During the ceremony, we could observe that the Wirrarika were an ethnic group, very proud of their traditions. Narration of the Peyote ceremony. We arrived at the semi-destroyed building where the group of Wirrarika were lodged about 6:30 a.m. Pedro had told us at dawn. We found them awake and conversing. There were 18 members originating from different settlements in the mountains of Jalisco. The group was formed in the following manner. Huicho was the oldest. In spite of the fact that his wrinkles denoted an age greater than 60 years, his body was strong, his movements agile, and his dress was quite humble, although in the Wirrarika mode. He was the Marahakame of the group. In his daily life, he was a very calm and peaceful man, and he spoke little. He worked the same as the rest in making hand-woven apparel, while they were in Rio de Catorce, and in the field when they were in the mountains. He went about accompanied by his wife, a woman also of advanced age, and by Guadalupe, his son, a likable and lively boy around 12 or 13 years of age, who participated in the same activities as the rest. Very close to Huicho was Vicente, a young Wirrarika of perhaps 25 years. In the beginning, we thought he was a somewhat culturated member of the community, given that his dress was not Wirrarika, but rather mestizo, khaki pants, plaid shirt, jacket, and boots. All the rest wore huaraches made from tires, sandals with a rubber sole made from old tires. The originals were made with a vegetable sole. Later we discovered that to have been a hasty appraisal, since Vicente behaved in everything like a Wirrarika. He knew every step of the ritual and participated actively in it. Really, the only appreciable difference was the clothing. Then there was Pedro. It was he who became closest to and with whom we conversed the most. His clothing was very complete, incorporating practically all the elements of Wirrarika dress. Nevertheless, his poverty level was undifferentiated from the rest. He was much younger than Huicho, and he was also a shaman. Although he was not a Marahakame, he was the second Huicho singer, and he knew how to heal. As is usual among them, he inherited this knowledge from his father, who was a singer and who put Pedro as a small child on the path, little by little, every year, a step. Yes, life is like a ladder, reaching up to God, but you have to work a lot. Think, because God speaks to you. He speaks to you always. Only we don't stop to listen. You people have one God. Poor things. We have many. Therefore, we are never alone. God is in everything, in the earth, in the plants, in the animals, in the water, in the people. That's why we love everything. Everything. And everything takes care of us. And then the whites tell us no, that the earth is not alive, that the clouds are not alive. Hence, if the earth is not alive, if the clouds are not alive, then how does it rain so the corn can grow tall and beautiful, keeping us alive? So, how can they give us life if they are not alive? Pedro was accompanied by his son, a child of about 5 years. There was also Hilario, Pedro's brother, about his age, but we gathered a little younger, since Pedro's authority over him was noticeable. Although their relationship was very cordial and affectionate. Hilario was quite a tall and thin Indian. He dressed like a poor mestizo, but he carried in his hat the feathers typical of the Wirrarika, the spirit. He was a very quiet man with a big smile. He gave the complete image of the good man. We could not describe him in any other way. Always in good humor, always with good advice. No, you shouldn't go around with women like that. For what? What good does it do? What good does it do you to go with one and then another if you don't learn to love? Look at me and my woman. We were married when I was 15. Many years have passed, and here we are together, so peaceful and content. I don't go with other women. She respects me, and we love each other. Maybe you think she is not very beautiful, but we have learned to love one another, and that for me is as though she were the most beautiful of all. Hilario was accompanied by his wife, who seemed a little older than he. They treated each other with affection. They had a son of hardly a year and a half, who nevertheless surprised us a great deal, since at his young age he already manifested an autonomy and confidence unusual in children of the same age. He was always playing, climbing up on piles of wood. He knew several songs in Wirrarika and some others in Spanish, as he understood both languages, although the language he spoke most was Wirrarika. He was a very friendly child in spite of the fact we were strange and Mexican. Next was Cirilo, who spent most of the time in the mountains, and also periods in Mexico City where he went to sell his arts and crafts. He was the most heavy-set of the group, without being really fat. He was about 30 years old, and he dressed in complete Wirrarika attire. His clothes were the most richly embroidered, perhaps due to his business in the capital. He was, without doubt, the humorist of the group, the one who made the rest of them laugh the most, even though every Wirrarika was a master of humor. Later we would discover that his role was of great importance in the Peyote rituals. Cirilo was accompanied by his wife, a young woman, maybe 18 years old, exceedingly beautiful. Her facial features were totally indigenous and could compete advantageously with any beauty from the city. She was also dressed in clothes that could be considered the best of the Wirrarika repertoire. They carried with them a child, perhaps 6 months old, which the woman always had with her, using a shawl to carry him on her back, thus keeping her hands free for working. There were also 4 small children, already able to walk, whose paternity we could not discern, since all the adults equally took care of them. Lastly, there was Tomás, a man we would consider perhaps the most enigmatic of the group. Tomás's expression was grave and silent most of the time, in spite of the fact that we observed him laughing on occasion. He seemed to be very close to Pedro. To our surprise, we found the owner of the restaurant there as well, the boss, and some of his friends of foreign origin who were noisy and displayed a false attitude of respect toward the Indians, more interested in their own addictions than in anything else. This was quite disagreeable to us, since we already felt ourselves intruding a little in attending a ritual of these men and women who have been suffering the hostile social cultural pounding of the West for several centuries. Nevertheless, we observed the Wirrarika acting as if these people did not exist. They did not seem bothered by their presence. They simply ignored them completely, even pretending not to understand Spanish when these people spoke to them. The owner they treated with enough consideration, although also with a little coldness. On one occasion, Pedro confessed to us that they knew the owner was robbing them with the amount he was paying them for their labor, since they knew at what price he sold their products in turn. But there was nothing they could do, as they had no capital with which to buy the raw materials themselves. We observed that the uncouth presence of these foreigners did not alter the course of the ceremony, since the Wirrarika knew with complete subtlety how to keep them behind the line. As it turned out, in the nocturnal phase, which lasted all night, these interested observers seemed to lose interest, and they fell asleep. It was the morning of the 30th of May. We did not know the purpose of the ceremony that we were to attend. Later we were informed by Pedro that it was a ceremony for the birth of the sun. When the new sun is born, everything is new. Everything begins again, but is different. We left the ruined mansion about 6:45 a.m., and we began to walk toward the mountains, in the direction of the most sacred place for the Wirrarika, after human Kaluabai, the sacred summit, La Unarre. The Wirrarika walked in silence, single file. Their pace was swift and quiet. Soon, Real de Minas remained behind, and the road became a stony path surrounded by green fields of grass. We found later that most of the year these mountains are dry. There was a dense fog covering the mountains, and the silhouette of the pilgrims outlined against them produced an effect that to our eyes evoked millennial traditions, making us think of the thousands of people who for centuries had visited this place with similar intentions, to encounter and propitiate the forces that rule the destiny of humans. As time went on and the group advanced, the fog began to disperse and the sun came out. We arrived at the summit of a mountain and walked along a small ridge, skirting chasms and ravines. When we had been climbing for about an hour, the Wirrarika decided to stop, since the owner's group had fallen behind and they could become lost. To our displeasure, we had to wait for them. While the whites arrived out of breath, the Wirrarika conversed. After a brief rest for the blonde ones, we continued on our way. The foreigners again fell behind, but now we did not wait for them, and they had to return by themselves. At one point on the way, we arrived at a small pond that was very significant to the Wirrarika. They became very content. Pedro took out a small bottle from his handbag and filled it with water from the pond after drinking a little. We asked him if it was good to drink. Why not? It's very good. You take a little, put it in your house, and it takes care of you. Water corn with it, and it grows huge, beautiful. With some trepidation, we drank the sacred water to quench our thirst and had no problems with it. Quite the contrary, we felt very well. Just before arriving at the summit of the sacred mountain, the men began to gather some dry trunks of maguey, and we decided to help. Later, we would learn that these logs were for feeding Tateware, the grandfather fire. At the summit of the mountain, the spectacle was impressive, especially for the Wirrarika. We were looking at the land where the luminous divinity Human Kuluabai was born. We found ourselves on the highest point of the mountain range. Below was an enormous desert valley, the place where the Wirrarika made their pilgrimages every year to carry out the hunt for the deer Peyote. The view from this height was magnificent. After contemplating for a while, the Wirrarika went into action again. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. Huicho and Pedro organized themselves to give life to Tateware. While the fire was coming to life, Huicho began to sing. Once the fire was going, the sun began to hide. An annular eclipse of the sun was taking place. The air turned cold, and the fire stood out more in the twilight. Pedro began to sing another text in something that seemed like a canon. Huicho had not yet finished his song when Pedro began singing his, and so on successively. Meanwhile, with devotion, the rest placed the food they had brought for Tateware. They placed the shawl on the ground and filled it with objects, transforming it into an altar. Upon it, they arranged chocolate, cookies, tejuino, a fermented drink made from corn, which the Wirrarika prepare, a yarn painting representing deer figures, peyote, corn, and the sun, in very stylized forms whose meanings we were unable to comprehend. By the time the altar was ready, the eclipse was total. Huicho and Pedro had in each hand muvieri, small staffs with colored feathers, sometimes with a squirrel tail containing the power of the shaman, that moved in time with their singing. Their singing, without being a chorus, maintained a very intense correlation. It produced in us an overwhelming sensation in spite of not understanding what they were singing, since in no part of the ritual did they use a word of Spanish. We found ourselves around the fire. The twilight in the middle of the day lent a dramatic effect to the lighting of candles, which took place at that moment. We too had lighted candles in our hands. The cookies were placed in a metal container and sprinkled with water from a sacred site, then passed out to everyone. The procedure was as follows. The container was passed to one of the members, who received it with reverence. The person made a series of movements with it first, as though toasting the cardinal points, and then straight up. He or she took a cookie, and after eating it, passed the container to another person, and so on successively. Some of the Wirrarika uttered words in their tongue while making the indicated movements. The singing of the Marahakame, Huicho and Pedro, continued practically without pause during the entire ceremony, which lasted about an hour. Except when they were arranging or preparing some of the material elements of the ritual. It was clearly impossible for us to penetrate into the profound meaning of the ritual. We did not understand the language they used. But also, the Wirrarika prepare themselves from the time they are very small to be able to participate in the ceremonies with the required devotion and precision. The dramatic effect that each step of the ritual inspired in the participants was manifest in their expressions as well as in their level of concentration. Once the ceremony on the sacred mountain was completed, they began to collect some of the elements on the altar, the yarn painting and the metal container, but they left the offerings of the cookies, chocolate, and tejuino in the fire. We were surprised at the facility the Wirrarika had for changing their state of being on a moment's notice. Hardly had they finished the ceremony, which had been very intense, when they became joyful and humorous. Later, we would verify that this apparent change of attitude was not what it seemed. Although they were smiling on the outside, they had inside a feeling of sacredness that was the result of ritual practices in which they themselves were made sacred. We would have required a much more extensive field study to determine to what point they maintained that attitude during their everyday life in the mountains. We descended the mountain by more or less the same route we took climbing up. At the halfway point, we stopped for about 10 minutes. We were chatting quietly, and Cirilo brought out a melon, which somehow he managed to divide among all those present. Later, from his same handbag, anyone would be surprised to see the great quantity of items the Wirrarika carry in their handbags. He removed a bottle of tequila, opened it, and passed it to Pedro. Pedro stood up to receive it. He removed the small staff with feathers he carried on his hat, and while inserting one of the feathers into the bottle and casting a few drops toward each of the cardinal directions, he uttered a series of words aloud with a force that took us by surprise. The maneuver was spectacular for its suddenness and, above all, for the power and conviction of his voice. After performing the action, he took a drink and passed the bottle to the rest. Each one of the Wirrarika wetted a finger upon receiving the bottle, cast a few drops toward the cardinal points as well as straight up, and then took only one drink. Later, we would observe that this action was carried out every time they took a drink. We asked Pedro the reason for the procedure, to which he responded, "When one is going to drink, before doing so, he offers some first to God, so he will take care of him. If not, he drinks too much, gets drunk, loses himself, and soon he is fighting, losing his money, or getting into trouble. On the other hand, this way, God tells him he will watch over him, and then he is at ease." We continued on our course until we arrived at Real, again at the house where the Wirrarika lodged. This was in the ruins of an abandoned house where they lived and worked during their stay in Real. Upon entering, we found ourselves in the patio around which were located different rooms, the majority without a roof. The patio also had no roof. The ground was of trodden earth, and there were a few wooden beams they used for sitting. There they were going to carry out, this very night, a peyote ceremony that would be a continuation of the rites they began on La Unarre. Pedro told us they were going to have a fiesta. We are going to play the little guitar, to dance and sing all night. With such a general description, we were left with the idea they were going to have an ordinary party, to have fun. Later, we would see it was something very different. At this point, after having been around them for some days, we treated the Wirrarika with a certain amount of familiarity, and they likewise with us. We were friendly, especially with Pedro and his brother Hilario, with whom we often spoke, and they answered our questions. About 12 noon, we departed, promising Pedro to return in the evening. Hikuri Neira. It was around 8 in the evening when we returned to the house of the Wirrarika. We found them lighting a fire in the center of the patio and making preparations for the fiesta. The group of foreigners we had seen in the morning were there. They were very joyful, joking and singing noisily. They were young Europeans of the type who travel with little money and whose slovenly appearance, long hair, and a liking for drugs earned them the loose title of hippies. Perhaps it was because they were noisy, or for some other reason that Huicho, in spite of being generally quiet and humble, asked them to leave. He spoke to them softly, trying not to appear discourteous. We looked on, wondering whether he was referring to us as well. He explained to them that they were going to have a fiesta that was for no one but the Wirrarika, that it was their custom and that outsiders could not remain, that the Wirrarika were not going to sleep and it would be very boring for the foreigners. He rejected all appeals from them, and they finally drifted away. We had taken refuge in the part of the house belonging to Hilario and his family. When we asked him, he told us we could stay, since Pedro had invited us. He also explained that when we had gone out earlier, the foreigners had remained there all day. They had been drinking, singing, and smoking marijuana. The Wirrarika did not know how to get rid of them. When it was time for the ceremony, there was no other solution than for Huicho to tell them directly. Once tranquility was restored, the Wirrarika continued with their preparations. They placed around the fire different elements. First were 2 equipales, chairs made of a material similar to reed, covered with deerskin, with an antler from the same animal, which served to support the back of the chair against the ground. These equipales were sacred elements to the Wirrarika. They used them for ceremonies, and only the marahakame, or on occasion, one of the helpers, was allowed to sit in them. They also placed a pair of metal chairs where the musicians would sit. On the other side of the fire, directly across from the marahakame's chair, was placed a yarn painting similar to the one used in the morning. Only the drawings were different. This had in the center a campfire out of which came something like little worms, which represented Tatawari, speaking to the Wirrarika. There also appeared ears of corn and symbols of peyote, as well as arrows and several figures in intense colors. Under the yarn painting, they placed objects similar to the ones in the morning, cookies, chocolate, feathers, wild tobacco, tejuino, and flowers. To begin the ceremony, the participants were grouped in the following manner. On one equipal was seated the marahakame, Huicho. Next to him, in the other equipal, was Vicente, occupying a place that to us seemed fundamental for the carrying out of the ceremony, since it was he who set the pattern for the songs sung by the marahakame. Next to Vicente was placed a metal chair in which Pedro sat. Besides being second Huicho singer, he had the task of playing a quite rudimentary small wooden violin. It was much smaller than a normal violin. Nevertheless, its sound was strong enough not to be lost in a roofless enclosure. Next to Pedro, following the circle around the fire, was Tomás, the quiet Wirrarika, who played a small guitar with characteristics similar to those of the little violin. Next to Tomás was the space set aside for the painting and the offerings placed next to it. The rest of the places were occupied indiscriminately and alternately by the different members of the group. Even we occupied these places while attempting to integrate ourselves into the ritual, as the measure of our goodwill and ignorance of what steps to follow allowed us. Some of the members of the group remained standing. All the Wirrarika of the group were reunited there. Women and children participated directly during the entire ritual. The smallest children, while not obligated to participate, took part almost in the same capacity as the adults. Babies participate in their mother's arms. It is significant to us that because the Wirrarika participate in their ceremonies practically from the time they are born, to participate in these events while still nursing must have an influence on their later life as children, young people, and adults. It was about 9 p.m. when Pedro began to sing, accompanied by his small violin and the little guitar of Tomás, instruments used exclusively in the rituals. Pedro intoned songs in Wirrarika for about 20 minutes, to warm up, as he put it. The structure of the songs appeared to be melodic segments that varied after a time. Pedro's voice, his attitude, and his personality in general changed completely the moment he began to sing. We were ignorant of what the texts were saying, but judging by the delivery of the singer, we supposed them to be of a very intense significance to the group. On another day, we would comprehend the why of this delivery. When in reply to one of our questions, Pedro would tell us that those songs had been taught to him by God that very night. Once Pedro finished singing, Huicho removed his small feathered staff from a small case made of palm leaves. This staff, the muvieri, he would hold in his right hand for the entire ceremony. At that moment, there were placed at the feet of both singers 2 small pieces of red flannel upon which all, through the night, the various objects used in the ritual were deposited and sometimes withdrawn. The objects on this flannel were so precious that they were not to touch the ground, and they could only be handled by the singers during the Peyote ceremony. The ritual objects were similar to what was on the first altar, as well as the sacred tobacco, gourds containing sacred water, power objects of the singer, candles, and many buttons of the precious cactus. At this point, the group of Wirrarika began to speak in their language. It was as if from this moment, the only language that could be spoken was Wirrarika, and the only world that had significance was the magic world that, through their myths, the Wirrarika were able to incarnate. After conversing for a while, the Wirrarika became silent. Huicho, the Huichol singer, raised his muvieri and began to sing. Everyone became very attentive. The song of the Marahakame was not accompanied by the musical instruments. Rather, he sang by himself, a cappella. The music coming from his lips was different from any other music we had heard. The words were pronounced with an accent distinct from that which they used normally. It even seemed to us that probably these songs were sung in some sacred language reserved for special occasions, such as the one we were attending. The songs of Huicho were, in general, short metric segments, repeated with melodic variations to the end. He repeated the same musical idea for a period of about 40 minutes, and then changed it for another. The Marahakame had been singing for about 20 minutes when something happened that surprised us. Pedro began to tune his violin and Tomas his little guitar. They plucked them softly to verify their intonation. This was happening while the Marahakame was singing, so it gave the impression of breaking the air of solemnity and respect. Our surprise increased when Pedro, accompanied by the violin and the guitar, started singing. At the same time, a different melody from what Huicho was singing. At the beginning, we did not understand what was happening. But as they continued singing, we realized that these two melodies that had seemed so different in the beginning harmonized themselves to form a more complex melodic phenomenon. Listening to the techniques they employed, we began to think the Wirrarika were familiar with the technique of counterpoint long before Europe would know it through Baroque music. Huicho and Pedro sang counterpoint for more or less half an hour, after which there was silence for 4 or 5 minutes. Next, Huicho introduced a new series of songs with a distinct melodic structure. Only on this occasion, after he had sung what seemed like a complete stanza, the rest of the Wirrarika answered him in chorus, repeating the same melody, after which followed a new one by the Marahakame, and again a repetition by the group. The songs went on in this way for maybe 40 or 50 minutes. Then Pedro began to play and sing similar to the way he had done before. Only now there was added a new element. At the moment Pedro began to sing and play the violin, the Wirrarika started a dance that, interrupted only at intervals, would last all night. The dance of the Wirrarika consisted of a rhythmic movement in which the feet were the most active, trying to follow the sounds produced by the violin. The hands remained quiet, hanging at their sides, or inside the pockets of their sweater if they had one. The body was kept leaning slightly to the front, and in addition to the continuous stamping of the feet, there were movements toward the front, back, and to the sides. During the ceremony, there were presented 3 basic elements, which were carried out alternatively or combined indiscriminately. The song of the Marahakame, the music of the violin and guitar, accompanied by Pedro's singing, and the dancing of the Wirrarika. There were moments when the Marahakame sang alone, others in which 2 distinct melodies were sung at the same time by adding Pedro's melody to that of Huicho, and others in which the people danced accompanied only by Pedro's songs as well as the violin and guitar. The cold increased gradually. At 1 o'clock in the morning, it reached its maximum, close to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and stayed there until morning. Without cringing from the cold, the Wirrarika continued with their ceremony as though nothing had occurred. The Marahakame, who wore only a light shirt, covered his back with a mantle. Vicente wrapped himself in a blanket, but he did not fail to answer Huicho's songs the entire night. We could not get over feeling impressed by the resistance of these people, who, with or without the cold, endured entire nights without sleeping, as though it were nothing. Since they, according to our information, had ceremonies lasting several days with their respective nights. We were especially amazed how the Marahakame, a man of advanced age, could withstand close to 15 hours singing in the bitter cold, which only subsided with the rising of the sun. The entire night passed amid songs and dances, interrupted only momentarily, to be continued shortly thereafter. From the beginning of the ceremony, Pedro from time to time distributed pieces of peyote to each one of the participants with the help of his brother, Hilario. We noticed they treated the cactus with care and reverence. Before giving a piece of hikuri, peyote, to someone, he had to place it on the eyes, ears, heart, and throat of the person receiving it, in order to see, in order to hear, in order to feel, in order to be able to sing. It was very clear to us that peyote is a fundamental element in the cosmovision of the Wirrarika. They use it not only to see, to speak, and hear their gods, but also to cure illness and tiredness, and to ensure good harvests. It is present in some form in the majority of their activities. We were eager, curious to know the effect the cactus would have on these people so far removed from our world, where psychotropic plants are used, not only in an irreverent manner, but in a degrading one as well. Everyone took the hikuri, men and women alike. The older children took it also, although in lesser quantities than the adults. It should be mentioned that none of the Wirrarika lost control or displayed behavior that could be termed inappropriate. What we did observe was a very intense emotion in each one of the participants, which we attributed more to the sacredness of the ceremony than to the effects of the peyote. The ceremony was not in any way monotonous, and the emotive response of the participants was highly variable. At a certain moment, the song of the Marahakame became more serious, more sensitive. His voice began in mid-range and finished in a clear falsetto that gave the melody a very sweet flavor. His muvieri vibrated as though it was driven by the power of his throat or by some ineffable force. His face displayed such strong emotion that we were profoundly impressed. Tears ran down his cheeks, and at times his voice seemed to break. From time to time, he wiped the tears from his face with the sleeve of his old shirt. The majority of the Wirrarika were weeping, even the older children. To see these men and women, generally so joyful, crying in that way, produced a lump in the throat and caused us to ask, what is it these people are seeing? What is the nature of their visions? What are their gods telling them? We felt admiration and respect for these people who have been able to preserve their identity, resisting not only the passage of time, but also, and this was the most admirable, the pressure of the civilized world during 5 centuries of infamy. Neither the weapons of colonialism nor the goodwill of the missionaries could despoil for them the magical inheritance of their ancestors. This people, who possess nothing and whose lands have been taken away, along with the possibility of cultivating the few remaining pieces, continue in spite of it all, defending their world, their language, and their traditions, as though to shout at the history and the vanity of the whites. We are still here. When it seemed the sadness had reached intolerable limits, the violin of Pedro and the guitar of Tomas came to rescue the participants from the melancholy that had taken hold of them. The dance seemed to animate them, and the voice of Pedro was very reassuring. Some smiles appeared on the teary faces. The feeling of brotherhood was evident from the silent but very expressive faces. When, in what seemed a most inappropriate moment, but in reality was the most appropriate, Cirilo told a joke. We observed the great ease with which the Wirrarika passed in one moment from one state of being to its opposite. In those few moments when songs as well as dances were interrupted, the Wirrarika conversed among themselves or with Grandfather Fire. During the entire ceremony, there was always someone to care for the feeding of Tatewari. It was about 4:30 in the morning. The atmosphere around the fire had changed in such a way as to make it seem as though the day before and its everyday surroundings had been left far behind. Now, the Wirrarika spoke in a low voice. They displayed an attitude of reciprocal camaraderie, very intimate and much more profound than we had seen them during the day. We were sharing the mystery of being alive. We were travelers in pursuit of the spirit, which also implied the difficult experience of looking at our lives. The Marahakame began to sing again. His voice, somewhat spent from the hours of effort, nevertheless displayed a spiritual intensity it had not had at the beginning. He was relating with his song the history of the world and the messages given them by the great-grandfather tale of the deer, Tamats Kahulamari. Toward morning, the Marahakame Huicho seemed to reach the point of maximum effort, not so much in relation to the entire night's work, as that one of the most important aspects of the work of the singer is to help the sun to defeat the stars so he can come out. The song of the Marahakame is company and a stimulus for the sun. The Wirrarika believe that every night, in some place in their territory, there is at least one Marahakame tending to the responsibility of helping the sun. That night, the responsibility was Huicho's. Thus it happened that at that moment, when the first rays of the sun began to appear, the Wirrarika became euphoric and joyful. The sun had heard their songs. They had participated in the solar miracle. With the dawn, new elements were added to the ritual. The Marahakame stood up and received the rays of the sun without ceasing to sing, pointed his muvieri, which is also considered an arrow, toward the sun. The light of day seemed to infuse him with new life. The exhaustion that a short while before had begun to appear in his face disappeared. All of their faces seemed transformed, giving the impression of their feeling sacred after having incarnated their myths. The Marahakame took a long rope, which he had prepared. Everyone stood up and grouped together around the fire, which continued to crackle. Huicho began to pass the rope around the group. Each one took the rope with his hands behind his back and passed it to the next. The rope went around twice. The singing of the Marahakame was continuous. As Pedro himself told us, now all of us are one. The rope was withdrawn. The next step was the sacrifice. Vicente and Hilario brought a goat that had been tied up in another part of the patio. The animal bleated as though it had a presentiment of the destiny in store for it. While the Marahakame continued to sing, standing and pointing his magic feathers at the sun, Vicente and Hilario laid the animal down in front of the painting of yarn figures. Vicente took out his knife and sank it into the breast of the goat, immediately placing a small container next to the bleeding wound to collect the precious liquid. Pedro took the container and, with a feather, sprinkled drops of blood on each one of the participants, as well as on the majority of the ritual objects, principally the candles. The animal continued to emit its last bleatings, while the women lit candles, which they passed to everyone. The singer, with his song and the power of his feathers, directed the goat's soul on the way to its destiny, the sun. The peyote was still periodically distributed. When the animal was dead, the Marahakame took a small cup of water from a sacred site. With a white flower previously wetted in the cup, he sprinkled a few drops of sacred water on the lips and then on the head of each one of the participants. Upon doing this, he uttered a few words. Once everyone had been touched with the magic water, each took a button of hikuri, cutting it into small pieces and then distributing it to all the rest. Everyone exchanged a piece of the sacred cactus, first having placed it on the heart, eyes, and ears of the person who was going to eat it. When everyone had finished distributing the peyote, the marahakame stopped singing. It was about 10:30 in the morning. More than 14 hours had passed since the ceremony began. The last step was changing the names of the participants. The procedure was as follows. They placed a pot of water between the fire and the marahakame, who had sat down again. The people took turns one by one. They leaned over the pot of water. They removed a little and washed their face and hands. They got up. At that moment, Pedro and Huicho began, in their tongue and in a humorous tone, to discuss the person who had washed his or her face. And they then gave each a new name. Each time someone was baptized, the rest laughed at the new name. When Pedro's turn came, it was Huicho who baptized him. Finally, Pedro chose a name for Huicho, who would not escape the baptism just because he was a marahakame. As far as we could tell, with that, the ceremony was finished. What followed was a little more lively, having to do with cutting up and cooking the goat, the meal for that day. Curiously, the marahakame designated 2 of us to skin it. The choice took us by surprise, but Guadalupe offered to lend us a hand in the task of skinning the goat, for which he had more experience than we. The ceremony had ended, and the world began, little by little, to be once more the everyday world for the Wirrarika, as well as for us. Although we had only taken part in it as observer participants, we were very grateful to the group of Wirrarika, who offered us the opportunity to be together with them in an experience that allowed us a glimpse, however slight, into their magical world.